The air buzzed with the soft hum of chatter and the clinking of champagne glasses. The grand hall of St. Catherine's Cathedral shimmered with warm golden light, its vaulted ceilings echoing the joyous laughter of 3 generations gathered to celebrate the baptism of baby Olivia. Katherine Davenport, the matriarch of the family, stood poised near the altar, her emerald green dress matching the sharpness in her eyes. Beside her, Richard Davenport, her husband of 40 years, exuded an air of forced calm. For weeks, Katherine had felt the prickle of suspicion, a nagging intuition she couldn't shake. The late-night phone calls, unexplained absences, and whispers of familiarity when her husband believed he was unseen. She didn't want to believe what the fragments suggested, but the truth had begun to piece itself together. Today, she was prepared to confront it no matter the cost. As the priest's final blessings concluded, Katherine's voice rose above the applause. "Before we celebrate, I have an announcement of my own." Her smile was razor-thin, her gaze steady on her husband. Richard stiffened, the blood draining from his face. The crowd turned their attention to her, curiosity mingled with unease. Katherine stepped forward, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Richard, you've been keeping a secret. A secret I believe you thought would never come to light." Richard stammered. "Katherine, not now." "Oh, now is the perfect time." She cut him off, her voice as cool as the winter breeze outside. From her purse, she pulled out a stack of photos, holding them high for all to see. "Everyone meet Jessica Calloway, Richard's second wife." A collective gasp swept through the room. The photos told a damning story. Richard and a much younger woman, smiling intimately in front of a courthouse. Another showed them at a secluded beach, his arm around her waist. The supposed second wife was in the room. Katherine had made sure of it. Jessica, a petite brunette seated in the far corner, froze as every eye in the room turned toward her. The newborn's cry broke the silence, adding a haunting echo to the tense atmosphere. "Jessica?" someone whispered, breaking the spell. Katherine's voice rose again. "Yes," the woman hiding there in the back, clutching her purse as if it holds her last shred of dignity. "This is the woman who's been playing house with my husband while he plays the doting grandfather here." Jessica's face flushed with a mix of anger and shame. "I didn't know," she began, standing up. "He told me you two were separated." "Lies," Katherine snapped. "Lies he's been spinning for years." Her eyes bored into Richard, who stood motionless, his mouth opening and closing as if gasping for air. "How many years, Richard? 10? 15? You think I didn't notice the money disappearing? The business trips that conveniently coincided with your marital vacations?" The guests stood frozen, caught between the scandal unfolding before them and their desire to slip away unnoticed. Katherine stepped closer to Richard, her voice dropping to a near whisper, though every word carried to the corners of the hall. "I would have forgiven the lies, the betrayal, but you brought her here to our family to this sacred day." Richard finally found his voice. "Katherine, please, we can talk about this." "There's nothing left to discuss," she spat, her voice breaking. "You made your choices. Now face them." Katherine turned to the crowd, her composure slipping for the first time. "I apologize for the scene, but I thought it best that everyone knows the man behind the mask." With that, she stormed toward the door, the sound of her heels reverberating like gunshots. The congregation parted in stunned silence, their whispers following her as she disappeared into the cold December afternoon. Richard remained rooted to the spot, his world crumbling as Jessica edged toward the exit, her expression unreadable. The once joyous hall now felt like a crime scene, littered with the shards of his double life. As the cathedral doors slammed shut behind Katherine, the echoes lingered like the toll of a death knell. Inside, the guests exchanged hushed words, their glances darting between Richard and Jessica. The priest, clearly uncomfortable, muttered something about the importance of forgiveness and quietly excused himself. Richard's hands trembled as he reached for a glass of champagne on the nearby table, but he never lifted it to his lips. The weight of the room's collective judgment pressed on him, more crushing than he'd imagined. Jessica, meanwhile, clutched her coat to her chest, her face pale but set in a determined expression. "I didn't come here for this," she muttered under her breath, her voice trembling. Richard turned to her, panic flashing in his eyes. "Jessica, wait. Don't go." She shook her head. "You lied to me, Richard. You told me this part of your life was over. I didn't sign up for this public humiliation." Without another word, she slipped out, leaving Richard standing alone in the center of the hall, surrounded by the ruins of his carefully constructed facade. Katherine hadn't gone far. She stood in the parking lot, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the stained glass windows of the church. Her breath formed small clouds in the winter air, but she didn't notice the cold. When she heard Richard's hesitant footsteps behind her, she didn't turn around. "Katherine," he began, his voice heavy with desperation. "Please, let me explain." "Explain." She spun to face him, her green eyes blazing. "You've spent years deceiving me, Richard. Years. And now you want to explain. I never meant for this to happen," he stammered. "Jessica. She was just a mistake." Katherine laughed, bitter and sharp. "A mistake? Mistakes don't last for a decade, Richard. Mistakes don't involve secret weddings and bank accounts." "I didn't know how to end it," he admitted, his voice cracking. "I was in too deep, and I didn't want to lose you, Katherine. I love you." "Love?" She took a step closer, her tone dripping with contempt. "You don't destroy someone you love. You've made a mockery of our family, of our marriage. And for what? For her." Richard had no answer. His shoulders slumped, and for the first time he looked old, truly old, in Katherine's eyes. "Here's what's going to happen," she continued, her voice now cold and resolute. "Tomorrow I'll be calling our attorney. There will be no more lies, no more double lives. You'll face the consequences of your actions, and I will move on. Without you." "Katherine, please." "No." She raised her hand, silencing him. "You don't get to plead your case anymore. You've had years to come clean, and you chose to live a lie. Now you'll live with the truth." Before he could respond, she turned and walked to her car. Richard stood there, watching as she drove away, the taillights fading into the snowy horizon. He was alone now, truly alone, his double life unraveling with every passing second. Inside the church, the guests began to disperse, the festive air completely gone. Whispers of betrayal and scandal followed Richard as he stumbled back inside, his chest tight with shame. The only sound that remained was the faint murmur of the baby, Olivia, cradled in her mother's arms, a small, innocent reminder of the family he had shattered. The snow fell softly outside as Richard retreated to the corner of the now empty hall. The decorations, once symbols of joy and celebration, now mocked him with their bright colors. He sat heavily on a wooden bench, his hands covering his face, the weight of his choices suffocating him. As the last of the guests trickled out, murmuring apologies to Richard's children and exchanging awkward glances, his eldest daughter, Amelia, approached him. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of disappointment and fury. "Dad," she said quietly but firmly. "What have you done?" Richard lifted his head, his eyes bloodshot. "Amelia, I never wanted this to happen. I didn't mean to hurt anyone." "Didn't mean to?" she repeated, her voice rising. "You've been lying to Mom for years. To us. You let that woman sit here today, pretending to be part of our family. Do you even realize what you've done?" "I made a mistake," he whispered, his voice cracking. "A terrible mistake. But I love your mother. I love this family." Amelia shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Don't say that. If you loved us, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have risked everything for someone else." Her words cut deeper than anything Katherine had said. Amelia had always been his pride, the one who defended him in arguments, who laughed at his bad jokes. Now her eyes held only contempt. "Does Christopher know?" she asked, referring to her younger brother. "Does he understand what's happening?" Richard swallowed hard. Christopher had left the hall early, his face pale with shock. "I don't know. I'll talk to him." Amelia scoffed. "Talk to him? What are you going to say? That you've been living a double life? That the man he looked up to is a fraud? Amelia, please, Richard pleaded. Don't turn away from me. I can fix this. Her laugh was bitter, mirroring Catherine's from earlier. Fix this? You can't fix this, Dad. You've destroyed Mom's trust, our trust. Do you even know how strong she's had to be to stand there and expose you like that? She deserved better. We deserved better. Amelia turned on her heel and walked away, leaving Richard to drown in the silence of the empty hall. He sat there for what felt like hours, the snow outside piling up like the debris of his shattered life. Jessica sat in her small apartment across town, her mind racing. She hadn't expected this. A public confrontation, the unveiling of secrets she hadn't even fully understood. She poured herself a glass of wine, her hands trembling. The wedding band Richard had given her sat on the coffee table, gleaming under the dim light. She picked up her phone, hesitating before dialing. When the line connected, her voice was soft but firm. Mom, it's me. I need to tell you something, and I think I need your help. Catherine, meanwhile, sat in her bedroom, surrounded by silence. The emerald dress she had worn to the baptism hung on the back of the door, a stark reminder of the day's events. A bottle of wine sat half-empty on the bedside table, and her laptop was open, a divorce attorney's website glowing on the screen. Her phone buzzed with messages, some from friends expressing shock and support, others from distant acquaintances fishing for gossip. She ignored them all, her focus fixed on the list of steps for filing for separation. Each click of the mouse felt like a severing of the life she'd built with Richard. But beneath the anger, there was a deep sadness, a mourning for the years she had spent believing in a man who didn't exist. She closed the laptop and climbed into bed, staring at the ceiling. Tomorrow would bring lawyers and questions, but tonight was for grieving. As the snow fell heavier outside, each flake seemed to bury the remnants of a fractured family deeper into the frozen earth. The morning came cold and gray, the fresh snow blanketing the streets like a shroud. Catherine woke early, though she hadn't slept much. Her mind was a storm of memories, questions, and the sharp ache of betrayal. The house was eerily quiet, its usual warmth replaced by an oppressive stillness. Downstairs, the faint aroma of coffee drifted through the air. She hesitated at the top of the stairs before descending. To her surprise, Amelia was already in the kitchen, dressed in a thick sweater, her hands wrapped around a mug. Morning, Amelia said softly, her voice subdued. Catherine gave a small nod. You're up early. I couldn't sleep, Amelia admitted, her gaze fixed on the steam rising from her cup. I kept thinking about yesterday, about Dad. Catherine pulled a chair out and sat across from her daughter. She reached for the coffee pot, her hands steady despite the turmoil inside. It's a lot to process. Amelia hesitated before asking, What are you going to do? Catherine's jaw tightened. I've already started looking into a divorce. I can't forgive him for this, Amelia. I don't think I want to. Amelia nodded slowly, her lips pressed into a thin line. He destroyed everything. Everything we thought we knew about him. Catherine reached across the table and placed her hand over Amelia's. I know this hurts, but we'll get through it. Together. The two women sat in silence for a moment, finding solace in each other's presence. The sound of the front door opening broke the quiet. Catherine turned, her heart sinking when she saw Richard step inside. He looked disheveled, his face drawn and pale. A duffel bag hung from his shoulder. I didn't think you'd be here, he said awkwardly, his voice low. This is still my house, Catherine replied coldly. What are you doing here? I came to get some clothes, Richard explained, avoiding her gaze. I'll stay at a hotel for now. I didn't want to disrupt anything more than I already have. Amelia rose from her chair, her face hardening. Disrupt? Dad, you've already blown up everything. What's left to disrupt? Amelia, please, Richard said, his tone pleading. I know I've ruined things. I just want a chance to make amends. Catherine stood, her eyes blazing. Amends? You can't undo what you've done, Richard. You lied to me for years. To all of us. You humiliated me in front of our family, our friends. Amends won't fix that. Richard opened his mouth to speak but closed it again, his shoulders sagging. He nodded silently, turning toward the stairs. Each step creaked beneath his weight as he ascended, a hollow sound that seemed to echo the emptiness left in his wake. Across town, Jessica was at her mother's house, seated on a worn couch with a blanket draped over her lap. Her mother, Evelyn, sat beside her, listening intently as Jessica poured out the tangled mess of her life with Richard. "I didn't know, Mom," Jessica said, her voice cracking. "He told me they were separated. He said the marriage was over." Evelyn sighed, her hands folded in her lap. "Men like that are good at lying, sweetheart. They'll tell you what you want to hear, what makes you stay. The question is, what are you going to do now?" Jessica wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her sweater. "I don't know. I feel so stupid. So used." "You're not stupid," Evelyn said firmly. "You were deceived. But you have to decide if you're going to keep letting him control your life or if you're going to take it back." Jessica nodded slowly. "I think I'm done with him. Completely." "Good," Evelyn said with a small smile. "Now, let's figure out how to start fresh." Later that evening, Richard sat alone in his hotel room, the duffel bag unpacked but untouched. The television played quietly in the background, a distraction he barely noticed. He stared at his phone, scrolling through messages from friends and family, some offering support, others demanding explanations. The weight of his actions pressed down on him. He had lost Katherine, his children, and any semblance of respect they once held for him. Jessica, too, had made it clear she wanted nothing to do with him. He was utterly alone, and for the first time in decades, Richard Davenport felt the full depth of his failures. As he lay on the stiff hotel bed, staring at the ceiling, one thought consumed him. He had spent years weaving a web of lies, and now he was the only one trapped in it. The days turned into weeks, and the fallout from Richard's double life continued to ripple through the Davenport family. Katherine moved swiftly, her determination unshakable. She met with her attorney, filed for divorce, and began untangling her finances from Richard's. Each signature on a document felt like a small reclaiming of herself. Amelia and Christopher rallied around their mother. Though Christopher had been quieter in his grief, his loyalty to Katherine was evident. He visited her often, fixing things around the house and ensuring she wasn't left alone with her thoughts for too long. The family dinners they now shared were bittersweet, a reminder of what had been lost, but also a testament to their strength as a unit. Richard's days, by contrast, blurred into monotony. He moved into a modest apartment on the outskirts of town, far removed from the grand home he had shared with Katherine. His phone rarely rang, and when it did, it was more often a creditor than a friend. He had tried reaching out to Amelia and Christopher, but their responses had been curt and distant. One day, desperate to mend the rift, he decided to visit Christopher unannounced. He drove to the young man's apartment, the familiar neighborhood stirring memories of their past. Christopher opened the door, his face blank when he saw his father. "What do you want?" "I wanted to talk," Richard said, his voice tentative. "To apologize. To explain." Christopher sighed, stepping aside reluctantly. "Fine. Come in." The apartment was simple but cozy, filled with framed photos of friends and family, none of which included Richard. The omission stung, but he kept his composure. "I know I've let you down," Richard began, sitting on the edge of the couch. "I've let everyone down, but I want to make things right." Christopher leaned against the kitchen counter, arms crossed. "And how exactly do you plan to do that? You can't undo what you did. You can't unhurt Mom. Or us." "I don't expect forgiveness," Richard said quickly. I want you to understand that I didn't stop loving any of you. I made terrible choices, but my feelings for this family never changed." Christopher's jaw tightened. "You don't get to use that excuse. You don't get to say you love us and then do what you did. You betrayed Mom, and you betrayed us." "I know," Richard said, his voice breaking. "I know, and I'm sorry." Christopher shook his head. "Sorry isn't enough, Dad. It's not even close. Richard swallowed hard, sensing he was losing whatever sliver of hope he had clung to. Is there anything I can do? Anything to start rebuilding? Christopher's eyes softened slightly, but his tone remained firm. That's not up to me. That's up to Mom. And honestly, I think you've done enough. Richard nodded slowly, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his son's words. He stood to leave, pausing at the door. I'll keep trying. I don't want to lose you, Christopher. You should have thought about that years ago, Christopher replied quietly, shutting the door behind him. Jessica, meanwhile, was carving out a new life for herself. With her mother's help, she moved to a new town and began working at a local boutique. The simplicity of her days brought her a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She hadn't heard from Richard since the baptism, and she was determined to keep it that way. One afternoon, as she sorted through inventory, her phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number lit up the screen. Jessica, it's Richard. I just want to say I'm sorry for everything. I hope you're doing well. She stared at the message for a long moment before deleting it without replying. Her chapter with Richard Davenport was over. Catherine's healing was slow but steady. She spent her days reconnecting with old friends, volunteering at the local library, and rediscovering hobbies she had abandoned during her marriage. There were moments of deep sadness, of course, quiet nights when the house felt too empty, when the betrayal still cut like glass. But there were also moments of hope. One evening, Amelia and Christopher joined her for dinner. As they laughed over old stories and shared plans for the future, Katherine realized something profound. While Richard's deceit had fractured their family, it hadn't destroyed it. In many ways, they were stronger now, bound by their shared resilience. For Richard, life remained a solitary struggle. He spent his days trying to rebuild, but the bridges he had burned were too charred to cross. He had lost the love and trust of the people who mattered most, and he knew he might never get it back. And so, as Katherine moved forward, surrounded by the family she had fought to protect, Richard was left to confront the stark truth of his choices. His double life had cost him everything, and the emptiness he felt was a punishment more profound than any he could have imagined. The seasons turned, and life for the Davenport family slowly settled into its new rhythm. Spring arrived with its promise of renewal, and Katherine found herself embracing the symbolism. She had sold the family home, deciding it was too steeped in memories to keep, and moved into a charming cottage near the edge of town. The space was smaller but brighter, filled with fresh flowers and a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. Her days became fuller with new routines. Katherine joined a local book club, started painting, and even began attending yoga classes at Amelia's urging. It wasn't just a way to pass the time. It was a declaration of independence, a reclaiming of herself after decades of living under the shadow of Richard's lies. Richard's life, meanwhile, remained stagnant. He had managed to secure a part-time consulting job, enough to keep the lights on in his modest apartment, but the isolation gnawed at him. His attempts to reconnect with Christopher and Amelia continued to falter. Amelia refused to answer his calls entirely, and while Christopher occasionally responded to texts, their conversations were superficial and brief. One evening, sitting in his dimly lit living room, Richard decided to write Katherine a letter. He knew she might never read it, but he needed to unburden himself. Dear Katherine, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I hope you do. I've spent the past months reflecting on the choices I made, the pain I caused, and the life I destroyed. I don't expect forgiveness, not from you, not from our children. But I want you to know that I'm truly sorry. I lied to you, and in doing so, I took something precious from you, trust. I see now that trust is the foundation of love, and I shattered ours beyond repair. You deserved so much better than the man I became. I want you to know that I've let Jessica go. Whatever I thought I felt for her pales in comparison to what I lost with you. It was a selfish, misguided attempt to fill something in myself that I couldn't name, and in doing so, I betrayed everything that mattered. I know this doesn't fix anything, but I hope it gives you some small measure of closure, some sense that I understand the enormity of what I've done. Take care of yourself, Katherine. You're stronger than I ever gave you credit for. Richard. Richard sealed the letter and mailed it the next day. He didn't know what he expected. Perhaps nothing. Weeks later, Katherine found the envelope in her mailbox. Her name scrawled in Richard's familiar handwriting. She hesitated before opening it. Her emotions a mix of curiosity, anger, and something softer she couldn't quite place. Sitting by the window, sunlight streaming over her shoulder, she read the letter slowly. When she finished, she folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. She didn't cry. She didn't feel pity. Instead, she felt a quiet sense of finality. That evening, Amelia and Christopher joined her for dinner at the cottage. As they ate, the conversation turned to their father. "Have you heard from him?" Christopher asked cautiously. Katherine sipped her wine, choosing her words carefully. "He wrote me a letter. An apology." Amelia frowned. And I think he's finally realized the damage he's done," Katherine replied. "But that doesn't change anything. I've moved on. We've moved on." Christopher nodded, relief evident on his face. "Good. You deserve better, Mom." Katherine smiled at her children, the people who had become her anchors. "We all do." As summer approached, Katherine found herself at peace for the first time in years. The scars Richard had left were still there, but they no longer defined her. She had built a new life from the ashes of the old, one filled with love, laughter, and the unwavering support of her family. For Richard, the world had grown smaller. He spent his days working and his nights alone, haunted by what he had lost. But even in his solitude, he found a sliver of solace in knowing that Katherine and the children were thriving. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. And so, as the Davenports moved forward, their paths no longer entwined, Katherine's life became a testament to resilience and renewal. A reminder that even in the wake of betrayal, there is always a chance for a new beginning. Autumn arrived, bringing with it a crispness in the air and a golden glow to the trees. Katherine's life continued to blossom as she leaned further into her newfound independence. She had begun hosting gatherings at her cottage, intimate dinners with close friends, lively book club meetings, and quiet evenings with Amelia and Christopher. One such evening, after her friends had left, Katherine found herself reflecting on how far she had come. The ache Richard's betrayal had left was still there, but it had dulled, no longer an open wound. Her new life felt vibrant and real, and for the first time in years, she felt truly free. For Richard, the season brought an odd mix of reflection and regret. His small apartment felt colder as the days grew shorter, and the loneliness weighed heavier with each passing night. His consulting work had slowed, leaving him with too much time to think. He often walked the city streets in the evenings, his mind replaying scenes from his former life, memories of holidays with Katherine, the children's laughter, and the warmth of a home he had taken for granted. One evening, during one of his aimless walks, Richard passed by a park where families were gathered. A group of children played on a swing set, their laughter piercing the silence. He paused, his chest tightening. He thought of Olivia, his granddaughter, and how much he had missed since the baptism. He hadn't seen her since that day, and the thought filled him with a deep, aching sorrow. Back at the cottage, Katherine received an unexpected call from her lawyer. "Mrs. Davenport," the lawyer began, "I wanted to inform you that Richard has signed all the final papers. The divorce is officially complete." Katherine closed her eyes, exhaling a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "Thank you." After the call ended, she poured herself a glass of wine and stepped outside to the small garden she had cultivated over the summer. The crisp air filled her lungs as she stared at the stars. The news brought a strange mix of emotions: relief, sadness, and a sense of closure. It was over, truly over. The following week, Richard made one last attempt to reach out. He sent a small package to Katherine's cottage. Inside was a single photograph from years ago, a candid shot of their family at a picnic, everyone smiling and carefree. Alongside it was a simple note: "I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'll always cherish the memories we made. Take care, Richard." When Katherine opened the package, she stared at the photo for a long time. A flood of memories rushed back, some painful, some beautiful. She placed the photo in a drawer and tucked the note away, deciding that while she could honor the past, she wouldn't let it define her future. By winter, Katherine had met someone new, a kind man named Victor who shared her love for books and quiet evenings by the fire. Their connection was easy and unforced, and though Katherine approached it cautiously, it felt like a step towards something meaningful. Amelia and Christopher noticed the change in their mother. She smiled more, laughed louder, and seemed lighter. "You deserve this, Mom," Amelia told her one evening, hugging her tightly. Richard heard about Katherine's new relationship through mutual acquaintances. It stung, but he knew he had no right to feel jealous. Instead, he focused on repairing the fragments of his life. He began volunteering at a local shelter, hoping to find purpose in helping others. It wasn't much, but it gave him a reason to get out of bed in the morning. He hadn't seen Amelia or Christopher in months, but he continued to send occasional messages, small updates that often went unanswered. Still, he hoped that one day, they might find a way to let him back into their lives. As the year drew to a close, Katherine hosted a holiday dinner at her cottage. The space was warm and inviting, filled with the scent of roasted turkey and the sound of laughter. Amelia and Christopher were there, along with Victor, who had quickly become a part of their lives. As they raised their glasses for a toast, Katherine looked around the table, her heart full. She had lost so much, but she had also gained something invaluable. The strength to rebuild, the courage to move forward, and the love of a family that had only grown stronger. Miles away, Richard sat alone in his apartment, the faint hum of a holiday special playing on TV. He lifted a glass of whiskey, toasting silently to the family he had lost and the lessons he had learned too late. For Katherine, the future was bright, a tapestry of hope and new beginnings. For Richard, the past remained a heavy burden, a reminder of the choices that had led him there. Life had taken them down separate paths, and though their stories had diverged, both were learning, in their own ways, how to carry on. As the new year arrived, Katherine found herself reflecting on the journey she had traveled since the day everything fell apart. Her life, once tethered to Richard's lies, was now hers to steer, and she had embraced that freedom wholeheartedly. By spring, her relationship with Victor had deepened. He was patient and kind, never pushing her beyond her comfort zone. On a sunny April morning, they took a trip to a nearby lake, the air filled with the songs of birds returning for the season. As they walked along the shore, Victor paused, taking her hand. "Katherine," he said softly, "I don't want to rush you, but I want you to know how much I care about you. You've brought so much joy into my life." Katherine looked at him, her heart steady. For the first time in years, she felt no fear of moving forward. She smiled. "I care about you too, Victor. Let's see where this goes." It was a quiet promise, but one that symbolized a future built on trust and hope. Amelia and Christopher had also grown closer to their mother, seeing her resilience as an inspiration. Amelia began bringing Olivia over more often, filling the cottage with laughter and the pitter-patter of little feet. Christopher visited regularly, always offering to help with home repairs or yard work. One evening, after Olivia had been tucked in for the night, Amelia spoke up. "You know, Mom, I used to think what happened to us would leave a permanent scar. But now I see it differently. You've shown us how to survive, how to thrive even after everything falls apart." Katherine smiled, her eyes glistening. "Life isn't always fair, sweetheart, but we get to choose how we respond. And I chose you, your brother, and myself. That's what mattered most." As summer approached, Richard made one final attempt to reconnect with his children. He sent a handwritten letter to each of them, apologizing for his actions and acknowledging the pain he had caused. Amelia read hers but didn't reply. She wasn't ready, and she wasn't sure she ever would be. Christopher, however, decided to meet his father. The two met at a quiet diner, the air between them heavy with unspoken words. "Thanks for meeting me," Richard said, his voice hesitant. "I'm not here to forgive you," Christopher replied firmly. "But I thought you deserved to hear this in person. You hurt us, Dad. You broke us in ways that will take years to fix. But I also see that you're trying to be better. I hope you keep trying." Richard nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "I will, son. I promise." It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was a start. By the year's end, Katherine had built a life she could truly call her own. The shadows of her past no longer loomed over her, replaced by the warmth of a future she had created. Her family thrived, and her relationship with Victor continued to grow, adding a quiet joy to her days. Richard remained a distant figure, living a quieter, more introspective life. He had found purpose in volunteering and had begun to accept the solitude that came with his choices. He understood that some bridges were burned beyond repair, and he carried that knowledge with humility. On Christmas Eve, Katherine hosted another dinner at her cottage. The house was filled with the sounds of laughter, the clinking of glasses, and the chatter of family and friends. As she looked around the table, she realized that while the path had been difficult, it had led her to a place of peace and love. Raising her glass, she smiled. "To us, to resilience, to hope, and to the family we've built." The room erupted in cheers, their voices weaving together in a chorus of strength and unity. Outside, the snow began to fall gently, blanketing the world in quiet promise. Katherine knew she couldn't rewrite the past, but she had reclaimed her future. And in the glow of the candlelight, surrounded by the people she loved most, she felt whole again.